How do we know what Latin sounded like in antiquity, or ancient Greek for that matter, when there were no tape recorders? Well, I think the clue to understanding that actually lies in these arches here that now run through this park in Rome. How does this all connect, and how do we know what Latin and ancient Greek sounded like? Let's explore that together. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. There are few ways that allow us to have an excellent picture of what Latin sounded like in antiquity. And we don't need a tape recorder to understand it. Something that these arches represent for me is how we have a piece of the ancient world that remains in our world, just like the Romance languages. We have a bunch, not just the 5 prominent and more well-known national Romance languages, but there are also dialects or less commonly spoken Romance languages, all of which give us insight into the sound of Latin. Now let's take 2 really common ones, really well-known ones, like Spanish and Italian. The letter A in these languages represents A, and the R sound, R. And those are just 2 sounds that we can see in the spelling of both languages that correspond almost identically, if not definitely identically, with the sound of Latin. So that's just the first part. As useful as the Romance languages are, that's only one of the legs of the metaphorical table that supports our understanding of the sound of Latin in ancient times. The testimony of ancient grammarians and other writers from antiquity telling us exactly how Latin actually sounds is outstanding. A lot of people don't realize that, for example, the ancient Roman grammarian Quintilian talks about the letter C, the letter K, and the letter Q in Latin. And he explains how the letter K is a completely useless letter because the letter C does the job of the letter K in every situation. This is one of the reasons that we know that the sound of C, even when it's in front of an E or an E, a letter E or a letter I, is pronounced with the sound K and not Ch. That sound developed hundreds of years later and wasn't found in antiquity. In addition to deliberate testimony from ancient grammarians or authors that talk about the sound of Latin, we have the incidental ways. For example, spelling errors, transliteration, or other mistakes that can happen. A great example is to see how the pronunciation of epsilon iota is actually rendered in Latin. And it's always consistently represented not as a diphthong, but as a monophthong. Some words have been borrowed from ancient languages into other languages that have been passed down to this day. A good example would be wine. Wine is from Latin vinum. That's why we know that absolutely the sound of the V as we normally write it in Latin is actually the same sound as the W in English, vinum. The vinum of Latin is then borrowed into Proto-Germanic or early Germanic languages as something like vinum, wien, the long E sound, and the long E sound regularly becomes I, a diphthong sound, in both modern German, Wein, and English wine. But we can see there that the older German sound was Wein, as it is in English wine, but that German, just like Italian and other Romance languages, changed the sound of the W into a V. That's a very common linguistic change. In addition to all of these pieces of evidence that we can put together, one of our best tools is the science of linguistics, the way that we know languages work and change. Certain characteristics of how vowels will change, the lengthening of vowels, the loss of phonemic vowel length, all of these are things that we can observe in languages that live and breathe today, if you will. And when you put all this together, we have something very similar to these arches here. Right now, I know that I'm standing on arches that supported an aqueduct, something that brought water from the high mountains around Rome into the city. And that right where I'm standing is the thing that supported that water and how it flowed. Well, how do I know that? Well, because it doesn't do that anymore, and anyone alive has never seen this particular object, this piece of architecture, serve that purpose. So even though we don't have actual video testimony to actually see the intact arches and aqueduct doing its job, we know it did that. The same way that we understand all kinds of things from history. The same way that we know that Caesar and Cicero were people. The same way we know that the Civil War happened when all we have are a few photographs from the American Civil War. We know these things happen because a combination of archaeology, understanding of how architecture works in theory, all kinds of testimony. That's why it's so great to learn Latin, because so much of history is actually written in Latin. It tells us that, yeah, this was an aqueduct. And that's how we can know with incredible certainty how Latin actually sounded. And ancient Greek too, for that matter. The idea that we need to have a tape recorder to actually testify the sound of Latin, to know something as plainly obvious as the sound of the Latin V was in fact W, a W sound, that the sound of the letter C and G was K and G consistently in classical Latin. No, you don't need a tape recorder to know that for certain. The ecclesiastical pronunciation is lovely, and anybody who wants to use it, I support it. I use it too sometimes, and I enjoy it. But that doesn't at all represent the sound of Latin in antiquity. Understanding the sound of ancient languages isn't only something we can do, and we can do it pretty well, but it's something we should do so that we can restore the voices of ancient authors. Thanks so much for watching. Valete. Perhaps my favorite of the pieces of in addition to the deliberate testimony of ancient grammarians and authors that talk about the pronunciation of Latin or ancient Greek, we also have the incidental ways. For example, spelling errors. The way that, but as a monophthong. For example, in a name I can't think of. Va bene. Wine. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing. I'm Luke. Cazzo, che sto a dire?